Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Luis Belen. This is Dr. Hans Williams, as Anthony mentioned. First of all, I want to thank AWS for having us. Before we get started, just show of hands, how many of you represent public sector? Show of hands. A lot. Private sector? Providers? Community organizations? Perfect. Let me start by giving you some background on myself, telling you my personal story, and then I'm going to give you an overview of NHIT, and Dr. Hans Williams is going to be talking about technology, the Data Fusion Center, and the work that we've been doing with Amazon. Why is health equity, why does it matter to me personally? Just a personal story. I was born in Puerto Rico, on the southwest part of Puerto Rico. If you haven't been to the southwest part of Puerto Rico, you've been missing the most beautiful part of the island. I'm biased, but it is a beautiful place. But when I was born in Puerto Rico, the first couple of years of my life, I lived with my parents in this small little house, no water, no electricity. It was in a farm. So come from a very humble beginnings. I didn't know I was poor. Matter of fact, I thought I was really well off. We could play, we had cows. The best, I would say the best years of my life. Then we moved to New York City in 1981, so I'm dating myself. But in 1981, we moved to New York City. This is, if you go back to 81, we grew up in East Harlem and in the South Bronx. That's me in front of Webster Projects in the South Bronx. I was there during the crack epidemic when the South Bronx had about, or New York City had about 2,000 murders a year. It was not an easy place to live, right? It was a difficult time in New York City. But the third picture that you see is the picture of my mom. See, my mom came to New York City, no GED. She got her GED. She got her associates. She got her bachelor's. Then she got her master's from Hunter College. And that's her treating her patients as a social worker with acupuncture in the South Bronx at Lincoln Hospital. And it was there that I saw my mom dealing with disparities in real time. So I was living it, but I was seeing how my mother was treating her patients and working with the community. Then I had the opportunity to go and attend the A Better Chance program outside Philadelphia. So I go from the projects to the suburbs. If you ever heard of Swarthmore College, that was my campus in high school. So I got to see another side of the opportunities that we all could have. And the rest is history. Went back to NYU, worked on Wall Street, and fast forward to about 8 years ago when I became the head of the National Health IT Collaborative for the Underserved. A little bit background on NHIT. NHIT has a unique story. We were launched in June 8th, 2008. It was I would call it almost a joint effort between the Office of Minority Health at HHS, the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities at NIH. But we had about 100 different organizations that came together to launch this new initiative. And our entire mission, our entire focus as an organization has been leveraging health IT to address health disparities. And focus on our 5 core pillars: workforce, innovation, policy, research, and community. Early on as an organization, we work with the national coordinators around the electronic health records adoption, patient portal adoptions. That was the beginning of high tech. And then over the years, a lot of that has evolved. Working with the White House, working with congressional leaders, even working with the U.S. territories like the U.S. Virgin Islands and the leadership. When I became the head of the organization in 2014, one of the things that I did is I worked with the White House to put a White House briefing. We also did congressional briefings. But here's some of our national partner stakeholders. This is just a snippet of the type of organizations that we work with. But let me give you some case studies, right? Because I think when Hurricane Irma Maria hit Puerto Rico in 2017, that's when everything changed for us. It changed for me personally. Just a little story. I mentioned I'm from Puerto Rico. I have what I call my tocayo back there, Luis Rodriguez from AWS, who was just chatting. Those of us that are in the mainland, we lost touch with our family members in the community in Puerto Rico. There was no way for us to actually communicate, be in touch with them. But for those of us that were constantly on the phone with them right, we knew this was a hurricane Category 5, and mind you, 2 weeks before, Irma had devastated the Virgin Islands. So we knew this was a serious hurricane that was coming. We just didn't know how devastating it was going to be. What was amazing is that we had partners like AWS and PwC and Sprint that worked with us to actually start moving efforts into the territories, right? I'll give you an example with Sprint. We teamed up with them and we put together with the FCC two-way radios that we was able to get into Roosevelt roads so that the federally qualified health centers were able to actually communicate. Simple things like that. But then that happened September 20th. September 30th, things got real for me. I lost my first aunt. October 12th, lost my father's sister, my second aunt, right? Preventable if the system was, if the healthcare system was up and running, but we all know that they were not. But that same night, my third aunt fell and literally broke her skull. And she needed backup surgery. And she had to wait literally a week to get brain surgery, right, with backup generators. That aunt today, she's bedridden because she gets all these constant strokes, right? So even how many years later, 5 years later, the consequences of Hurricane Maria are still being felt in these communities. So I give you that story is because this is when I said, and this is when I realized NHIT cannot just be a convener. It cannot be just about bringing us together. It had to be an actionable effort. We needed to get out into the communities more proactively and making sure that we're helping those communities. Another project that I want to highlight is this Telehealth Equity Coalition that we launched last year. And the Telehealth Equity Coalition is our effort to talk about the importance of telehealth and adoption of telehealth in underserved communities, right? And COVID highlighted the importance of telehealth, but the reality is that our communities were not benefiting from telehealth the way they should. Right, so this has been our quest, national at the federal, state level, to try to make sure that our communities are benefiting from the promise of telehealth.
And just one other quick thing to highlight here, Luis, is the time period, right? This was only launched about a year ago, and the number of organizations have already passed 200. So the adoption and the need has, sort of been spoken by industry here.
Exactly, and this is what's unique about this, is this has been an industry effort, and then our public partners and others have joined as well. One of the things that, if you go to telehealthequitycoalition.org, under the blog sections, you'll see a white paper that we released, focused on infrastructure and the impact on health equity. And that's extremely important because as we're looking at the infrastructure bill being passed, and broadband in rural communities taking place, we got to make sure that that last mile, that our rural communities and underserved communities adopting, have access to broadband, but we're working with them as well. So that white paper highlights the importance of that. The last case study that I'll share before I hand it over to Dr. Williams is this project that we did, that we're doing with Sanitas. Sanitas is an international organization in 9 different countries, big in Colombia. But what's unique about them, because of the communities that they serve internationally, is that they have been really working with community health workers, right? Engaging communities. And so we teamed up with them to look at this comprehensive healthcare type of model to address health equity, where you connect digital solutions with the community health worker efforts. And in this project, we're doing demonstration projects in the Virgin Islands, as well as migrant and seasonal farm workers. And it's a unique project, but it all comes down to what Dr. Williams is going to talk about, which is the NHIT Data Fusion Center. So, Hans?
Yeah, thanks, Luis. So, what have we learned from not only these 3 case studies that Luis has gone through, but also the other case studies that NHIT has been working on over more than a decade now as it relates to SDOH and health equity? I'm going to talk about a couple, the 2, 3 main issues that we've seen, sort of commonalities across these case studies, and then how we as an organization with fellow partners are actually solutioning for them. So probably comes as no big surprise to anybody. There's a growing amount of data, and the variety of the SDOH data that is being created just is exponential. As a brief review, right, when we talk about SDOH, we're not just thinking about traditional healthcare data, traditional biomarkers, what's my hemoglobin count, how's the hematocrit. We're focused on these external domains as well that encompasses who and what makes that person a person. It is their financial ability to afford care. It is their ability to go back and forth between their home and the care providers. It is their ability to put food into their body, right? It is their housing, having a safe environment to reside in. So when we look at all of these different domains, right, and then we begin to put the pieces together of where does this information live, siloed in a whole bunch of different places, right? Right now, when we just look at federal, state level, 40,000 plus different government agencies. 2019 data, nearly 1,000 registered health insurance companies. We have roughly, say, 4,000 to 5,000 different non-government hospitals here in North America, depending on how you want to count what a hospital is. And then thousands of different vendors, right? I'm sure you guys have seen and can ramble off at least a few hundred that are trying to tackle problems and issues related to SDOH. So we have all of these different key stakeholders that are then also using all of their own different types of somewhat proprietary, some are using more standardized tools to then collect and store this information, right? Bunch of different patient-reported outcome tools, bunch of different onboarding questionnaires that, say, United Healthcare or maybe BCBS might be using, versus how, say, one of my organizations like Stony Brook might also be collecting that information. So we have a variety of different assessment tools, different languages, different reading levels, different ways of scoring, right? So pretty complex problem. Now, another problem that we have is interpretation bias, and this has been, I think, very interesting to talk about and hear professionals debate on, that we increase our interpretation bias when we decrease the diversity of those that are interpreting the data. So what does this mean, right? So when we are looking at, say, patient data specifically related to SDOH, can the individuals that are trying to draw the conclusions, are they actually capable of drawing them based on their own background? So ideally, right, we want to be able to have a group of individuals that looks like this, right? Highly diversified, Luis, a variety of different backgrounds. I don't see anyone here from Puerto Rico, but maybe there is someone from Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico has all those genetics, by the way.
But we want something that looks like this, almost kind of like what this audience in this room right now looks like. But what we typically get, though, right, is someone that looks like me, cookie cutter clone, and for someone like myself, say white Caucasian, mid-30s, don't really have any chronic diseases that I'm aware of, knock on wood, and relatively healthy. So my ability, right, to interpret, to have that emic perspective as it relates to the individuals that my data decisions are going to be impacting is fairly limited. But now what happens if we mix this up a little bit, right? Is this going to dramatically change the perspective? What if we make it a little bit more diversified? But who are we potentially missing here? Yeah, women, right? So what we want to be able to strive towards is something that looks like this. That when we are, say, whether it's the private sector, public sector, we need to figure out a way of solving this problem, which will describe our solution, but making the individuals that are interpreting the information that we have are also some of the key stakeholders, that they are ultimately the individuals that will be impacted by these decisions. So, quote that I like here, when using, say, machine learning AI, SDOH needs to represent what the data should be, not what is. So when we look at then what do we have today? So this is information from 2021. I doubt it's really changed much since then. When we look at, again, broadly speaking, data-focused roles, data scientist, data engineer, give or take 70% male, average age, late 30s, and majority is Caucasian. So we have some room for improvement there. And then lastly, we've encountered this problem of failed adoption when we've been working in the case studies that Luis has described, is that it's sometimes tricky to be able to get consumers. You could build the best thing ever, right? But then they're not going to come unless they understand how to actually use what it is that we've built for them and they understand it. We show something like this, right? People are going to run towards the hills. Maybe not this audience, but we're a little bit more, say, familiar with some of the standard, ways of slicing and dicing the data programmatically. But we can't show this to an end user who's community-based that might not be college educated. But we still want them to be able to help us interpret this data so it's interpreted through the lens of the community in which it's going to be impacting, which leads us to the Data Fusion Center. So this is one of the technologies that we've been working on in collaboration with a few partners that Luis will talk about in just a second. But our goal here is to enable the sharing and crowdsourcing of SDOH data between public and private entities. So I'll just pass the baton over to Luis just for a minute or two to talk a little bit about the background and why the Fusion Center was created.
Yeah, so little interesting part before I talk about the Data Fusion Center. Before the Data Fusion Center, we did a project with the Office of Minority Health around the cultural and linguistic standards class. And the goal there was, can we use ACS data and a language index to look at which communities had language barriers around the country. That was the beginning, what we call the dashboard, the NHIT dashboard. Fast forward to about 2-3 years ago, we started working with Amazon on looking at, can we look at SDOH data, open source SDOH data, and bring it together. We know that CDC and CMS and all of these government agencies have open source data. But for the average person or a professor or a researcher, trying to find those data sets is difficult. For them to, where do they go and find those data sets? And make it in such a way that that data is actionable. Well, with working with Amazon, we teamed up with them and one of the preferred partners, Tyler Technologies, on developing the Data Fusion Center, and we use Tyler's Technologies platform called Socrata to actually centralize all of this SDOH data. When we launched about a year and a half ago, we had about 100 million rows of data. Now we have over 10 billion rows of data. So, and Hansa show you, and we even have a whole data lake at AWS, but you'll be able to see shortly in terms of how we're able to layer. Where are the hospitals? Where are the federally qualified health centers? Where's the transportation? And then you take that, and now you can start looking at where the high cancer rates or where are diabetes. And that's all done through the Data Fusion Center. And the third part of it is being able to tell the stories. So we'll talk in a few about our academic partners as well. Hans?
All right, thanks, Luis. So what we have here with the Fusion Center, simply put, is we're trying to be the central hub here of a go-to one-stop shop, again, aspirational goal, right, where you could find any type of SDOH-related information. So big part of what NHIT has done and continues to do is form collaborations, very active, very deep conversations between the private and the public sector to incentivize them to bring data into our environment so then we can cleanse it and open source it and then make it more available to not only the technical individuals that can just hit it with an API and bring it down, but to those individuals that would just rather have a graphical user interface and graphical representation of what that information holds. So key capabilities here, nothing that should really stand out, ingestion, transformation. Then we have a number of different tools that we've custom built around data discovery using open source technologies. And then we are working on a couple different ways of then sharing this information to make it more approachable to not only professors like myself that might have more technical know-how, but also community members that don't know Python or R or Go or any of these other data languages that you might be able to use to bring the information down. So I had mentioned there's this first problem around silos and interoperability. We have increasing volume and variety. So how are we attempting to solve this problem that we discussed earlier? So primary part here of the Fusion Center, and we kind of view this through sort of tentacles, is that we start off with government, state, and private entities. And from here, then, we then grow into the different departments of health and human services within the state agencies and federal government. We're also pulling down and aggregating and caressing, cleansing the open source information, say, from CDC, FCC, and a whole bunch of other different agencies that you might not necessarily associate with SDOH, say like the Department of Justice, Homeland Security. Who would have known? I would have not known that Homeland Security actually has the most active and up-to-date geographical resources for where all of our pharmacies and hospitals are. It's actually, one version or variation is under the Department of Homeland Security. I did not know that. So we then work with these different main buckets to then create what then turns into a nice spider web effect. And here's again where NHIT really plays a key role in the adoption and curation and bringing the recognition that it's built over the last decade plus to do good with the data. NHIT's mission is very person and I'd say patient-focused and orientated. So that's something that NHIT and the Fusion Center is very much so leaning on, that we want to be a trustworthy place where people, consumers, can go retrieve this information and then hopefully do something great with it. Interpretation bias. So how are we solving this? And this is actually where I kind of come into play here. So What NHIT has then done is they've partnered with a number of different academic universities. So myself, I run a program, Stony Brook University, where we teach the next generation of health informaticists. Only about, say for the next cohort that we just finished and onboarded yesterday, probably about 10% Caucasian, other 90% non-Caucasian, with a pretty large number coming from disenfranchised backgrounds. So very much so not like myself. They don't look like me and they don't think like me, which is what we want, because I'm from a certain background, acknowledge that, and then we need to bring in other individuals to help me understand how to interpret this data correctly. So in addition to Stony Brook, Howard, Tulane, and we want to bring in other academic universities as well to really have students work with this data. And again, some of these students are very technical, some of them come from comp sci backgrounds, while others are sociology students, anthropology, coming from very non-traditional, non-comp sci, non-engineering backgrounds, but what do they have? They have other ideas, other ways of thinking, the whole cross-pollinization, right, of, where do great ideas come from? I think they come from merging together different thoughts from different industries. So if we could then bring in and amalgamate together more of the diversity of thoughts that exist in non-computer science, non-engineering, non-healthcare even, I would say, backgrounds, I think we'll be onto something. So that's been our approach.
And Hans, on this is to me extremely important. Traditionally, for our historically black colleges and universities, and those of us working on health equity and in community, it's been difficult having access to this data in a way that you could actually work with the data, right? Unless you're a data scientist like Hans, it's
even I struggle, yeah.
It's difficult for you to access. So our goal has been, can we get this data in front of professors and their students for research purposes? And one of the key here, as a Latino, I would probably see data a little bit different than an African-American female, et cetera. So depending on who's evaluating the data and what issues is of concern, right? They're gonna interpret data a little bit different. And so our goal is to make this data available to the communities and to the students, whereas before it was difficult. It was only in the hands of a few to access it. And that's been our goal with this project, is to make sure that we use these pilot efforts to make sure we get the data in front of the right people.
So what have we then done here? What have we accomplished thus far, and where are we going? So with the Fusion Center, we've been able to bring together, again, using sort of low-code, no-code type approaches in partnership with Tyler Technology, variety of different geographical maps that very easily layer together very complex data sets that we bring into the Fusion Center to say, like, here's an example where we created a infrastructure map, bring in, say, hospital data, where farms are, and I think this was actually for one of the pilot programs, right, Luis?
Right. Yeah, we wanted to see in this particular instance, where are the farms located and where were the H-2A seasonal farm workers located. So the blue represents the H-2A seasonal farm workers, and the reason being is that there's really not a lot of good data. Even USDA will admit to this on the migrant farmers, right? So we used the Department of Labor data on H-2A so that we could see which farms were applying for those applications and give us at least a good indication of clusters. And then looking at where the farms are located, and then where are the hospitals and the federally qualified health centers are located, to look at access to care of some sort. So this is, to us, almost an infrastructure map that we could add the federally qualified centers, the pharmacies, the public schools, right, housing as well, into these communities, so we could get a good sense of what's going on in the communities.
All right, so then one of the other problems we talked about, decreased adoption when there is issues related to tech literacy. So with platform that we've been working on, again, we throw our end users into a couple different buckets, those that are tech literate, those that are non-literate as it relates to technology. So for our non-tech literate or those with growing tech literacy, very simple GUI, upload, download, metadata mapping, etc. So all of that is there, also safe from a user perspective of what would otherwise be a bunch of Python code to say create some type of heat map or geospatial analysis. Could sort of do that all here with a couple clicks of a button.
Just real quick on this. So this, if you could go back to this exercise, if you bring all the different data nationally in the map, it gets really crazy, right? You add the pharmacies, the hospitals, et cetera. The red is all the railroads in the country, but then you can actually zoom into a specific community, right? And that allows us to be hyper-focused. But let's say, for instance, you have in there, you see Sanita Medical Centers. If you are a hospital system and you have clinics or federally qualified health centers, we can actually bring it in to the platform and look at your communities, what's going on around your community from an SDOH perspective. But it starts from a national data sets down to the zip code and down to the community.
Yep, zip code and FIP code and all of those fun ways of slicing and dicing this. So how do we actually make this happen? So like I said, we've created some of our own custom uploader tools. We're then using Amazon Web Services to host and store the data, also with a number of different ways of transforming it that I'll get into. And then sort of final bucket here, we're then using some also open source technologies to be able to not only, say, use the Fusion Center, but other BI tools that, say, if we're working with an academic partner, that they could easily plug and play into. So as a quick example here with one of our custom uploader tools that we created with AWS, we have two different ways. It's sort of, again, technical on like the lower end here and more of a user-friendly version up on top. Both of them, though, powered by Amazon Gateway and also Lambda services for doing transformation. And again, we're trying to keep things as simple here as possible. There's probably a lot more streamlined ways or maybe complex ways of doing this, but our sort of goal here is to make it as simple as possible. So having a simple GUI, using just one or two services, throwing it into an S3 bucket, and using Amazon for all of the provisioning and version control, scalability, et cetera, and that's worked out really, really nicely for us. So where does some of this data come from? And I think this has been one of the most interesting parts also for me as a faculty professor, sort of constant learner. So 2018, interestingly enough, there actually was another Government Data Act a couple decades ago, but 2018 Open Government Data Act. As a quick show of hands, has anyone heard of this? Okay, yeah, because there's a lot of people here from government, but this was new to me. And I think the other interesting part here is with the Open Government Data Act around the interoperability of the data dictionaries and the standardization of metadata. So what we've done is we've tried to take advantage of not only, say, the structured metadata that you could find around, say, whether it's the USDA, Department of Energy, FCC, Homeland Security, CMS, but then also looking at some of the, say, other resources that are relevant for us, like PubMed, where there's abstracts and also a semi-structured JSON format. So what we've then done is we've tried to aggregate together a pool of all of these different resources and streamline them into our own sort of data pipeline where on a very sort of simple cron job, we could ingest this information from all of these different data sources, from all these different federal agencies and their data dictionaries. Again, I was very much so amazed at the structure and the sort of cleanliness when I've been mostly working in hospital settings, and when I moved from one hospital to another, even though there's fire, HL7, all this interoperability stuff, you don't really see it or feel it as a clinician. So our sort of core services here for automating and keeping our own data lake up to date Again, we leverage S3 a lot. We have some Lambda functions, and then also I've really been a big fan of the managed airflow service now. Prior, we were sort of setting that all up ourselves. So the AWS managed airflow service has really been a great tool for us because we're a very small team and we don't have a lot of money or resources for a big engineering team. So being able to leverage that service for us, I think has been very beneficial, probably saved me a few hours of sleep. And then when we're doing the transformations, so there's some custom things that we've been working on as it relates to trying to, say, perform additional NLP on, say, whether it's PubMed articles that might relate to SDOH and bringing in, say, the associated LOINC codes or some other type of medical codex with them, depending on what it is. We found Amazon Comprehend to be a really good tool and solution for us. And then when there's, say, specific examples of maybe a LOINC code or some other piece of information that we're trying to make more interoperable, we'll use the sort of Docker, and I guess it's been maybe a couple years now, forgive me on the dates, but being able to run Lambdas and have a Docker image being executed with that Lambda function. It's been also a great enhancement for us as it relates to package management and having, say, one source code to be able to run off of that. So I had then also mentioned that we are also not only using a variety of different Amazon tools to make this data available to our end users. So Socrata, one of our big technology partners for the Data Fusion Center, Amazon QuickSight, we've also been exploring and have had really good feedback around, again, sort of very easy BI tool for some of our users that are familiar with Tableau or Looker or another type of data dashboard. Amazon Alexa, I think it was earlier on in the pandemic, we were working on how do we make some of this complex information also more disability friendly. Say if, you've lost your sight, you've lost your vision. So we had created a couple prototypes using the Alexa API, bringing in some of our COVID trends data. So you'd be able to, again, ask Alexa, based on my zip code, how are things trending? And then for our more technical users, Amazon SageMaker, that want to do, say, more geospatial analyses and are more familiar with coding languages. Then from the open source tooling set, I think really the main thing here that I've really had a lot of fun working on is Melee. It's a TypeScript safe search engine where it's a JSON document based. So it's worked out actually really nicely for us, knowing that the majority of the federal resources that are available to us are already in JSON docs. So we've been playing around with Melee as a way of quickly creating a searchable index where we just throw in those JSON docs, and then we also get a lot more granular search. So as an example, if you go to, say, data.gov or healthdata.gov and you use their search engine, what you don't necessarily have the ability to do is to drill down to the individual column level or the feature level. So that's one thing that we've actually built out that you guys can try out at find.nhit.org. You could register, get a free API key, and explore that. I think right now we probably have it's like 30 to 40,000 data sets that have been fully scraped, clean, and ready to go. So where are we going next then? Basic data maturity model here that we're following. Where we're at right now is really trying to build the backbone and create the infrastructure so that we can get to the more complex, fun stuff. So right now we're very much so descriptive and diagnostic, and where we want to be able to go is to actually get to the final stage if we go off of this model of being able to recommend behavioral change or be able to recommend different ways of looking at a problem based on the data that we have in front of us. But in order to make this happen, it's really about partners. So maybe I'll pass the baton back over to Luis to conclude here.
Yeah, and I think, thanks, Hans. This is the key part, right? NHIT has been working on this whole focus on addressing health disparities and impacting the communities. But we cannot do it alone, period, end of story. We can only make a difference if we work together, right? We're only as strong as our partners. I can't thank Amazon, AWS enough. I can't thank Stony Brook enough, and Tyler Technologies, and all of those partners that work with us to make this a reality. But data, for the sake of data, is just data, period, right? That we need to now look at how do we make and have this data actionable. How do we now start changing behavior and start working with the community to provide, give them access to the resources and make them aware of the resources that they have? How do we now look at health literacy? So now the next phase of this project, yes, we'll continue increasing the data lake. Love to have 100 universities using the Data Fusion Center, and also the whole ecosystem, health ecosystem. But to me, if we're not engaging the communities where I come from, where you come from, both from rural and urban communities, including the U.S. territories, if we're in our disability communities, if we're not reaching the communities where they are, right? I like to tell Hans and the group when we're having these conversations, look, politics is local, disparities is local. Right. The bottom line is that what a rural community sees as disparity is going to be different from a U.S. Virgin Islands that has 4 islands, and they gotta either, if you want health care, you got to go to Puerto Rico, San Juan, or sometimes come back to the mainland. That's the reality in the Virgin Islands, right? So to me, my ask to all of you, join us in this effort. Right? NHIT is driven by collaboration. That's in our name, by design, and working on how can we solve these issues together, right? So see us afterwards, follow us on, visit us at nhit.org, and look at the Data Fusion Center. We're here to work with all of you to make a difference.
All right, thank you.
Before we conclude, are there any questions? I think we have a couple of minutes, but are there any questions from the audience?
So when you're using your data lake, how long did it take you to get from the, how long did it take you to It's working. How long did it take you to get from the diagnostic to the predictive? Because I think that's where the real difference maker is. What challenges did you face to put together the pieces to get to the predictive and the prescriptive?
With the mic, okay, so that's where we're going. So right now what we've done is the descriptive and diagnostic, and I think we're trying to prevent some of the challenges that we've seen others face, say, as it relates to version control of data sets that are used for predictive modeling, right? Like how important it is to have traceability to prior versions of the data that then recommended you take XYZ action, which again, simple as, why we're also really liking the S3 bucket thing, because makes version control very, very easy, right? So I think we're trying to learn from some of the companies that have been very early on to the operationalization of machine learning, AI for healthcare purposes. So we're not there yet for NHIT, but we're on the verge, we're on the sort of cusp, and it's then really working with the partners to figure out what are the most appropriate questions or things that we can be predicting, because to Luis's point earlier, data for the sake of data is just, an academic effort, right? And, then you sort of call on me to scratch my head about it and maybe write a research paper. So we've been very methodical, I would say, about just not running into it, even though we already have, say, the infrastructure to begin to start, right? Anyone can use a tool now like AutoML, throw in a data set, choose what the outcome is, and then get 1,000 different, versions or ways of coming up with a model. But we don't want to go down that route, and we want to be very methodical. So without answering your question, I guess that's my answer to it. Yeah.
But in that same vein, what's the most satisfying, I guess, policy and also satisfying technological venture, right? You showed all those cool things, but what's been satisfying from a policy and some of the challenges you have there, but what sticks out to you that makes you happy?
Yeah, so having our telehealth equity coalition using the data to have their action being data-driven has been a game changer for us. But something that stood out for us, we using the Data Fusion Center, we did a little sample on the infrastructure. We was looking at clinical trials, and we looked at Nashville, Meharry College. Why participation in clinical trials was not as good as Vanderbilt. Well, we looked at, and you realize there's not enough bus stops around Meharry College. So access to the clinical trials, unless you're providing transportation to the participants, you're not going to get the same type of adherence. So it's little things like that we could pinpoint that to us. We talk about over the years, like we need access to data. Now when you see it from this lens, from an equity lens, you start realizing this is real, right? And there are just little tweaks to make a difference, right? But you can make the data proactive, right, in terms of the work that we do.
Very interesting. I think looks like you're getting into multidimensional analysis, and what you're trying to do is establish a relationship between activities, audience, transactions, and interactions. And I think it's a great problem to solve, and I think two companies have already done that. If you look at Amazon with they call it the purchasing graph or the purchasing data graph, they're basically able to take all the data from Prime, from Alexa, from Amazon Music, and what's happening on the AWS e-commerce side and analyze it. And same thing, Google is doing that, and they call it their knowledge base. Mm-hmm. But I think by solving this, getting into multidimensional analysis, it'll be of a lot of value, because I think I just mentioned 4 dimensions. You could add 2 more dimensions to it, and you could solve all the CRM issues as it relates to sales, service, and marketing. So I think you're on the right path, and I get excited because I think that is the holy grail or nirvana, when you're able to get to the bottom part of it. So you're right, you need to do the first 2 steps, and now leveraging data, AI, algorithms, and if companies can share some of that, I think you'll get to it, because we need that when you're looking at healthcare data, because trillions of dollars are being spent, and with that kind of database, I think the data that you have collected from different organizations is actually a gold mine. So hats off, I think great project, and good luck on that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe just the one thing to add on to that, which I think to emphasize, is then who is interpreting even, say, the output of the ML AI, right? If it's students, or if it's community members that are then also trying to help us understand what is the impact of that output, makes a big difference.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you're right? That's why I asked for our partners to get involved. But let me do a shameless plug to Amazon and the account executives. NHIT, as a nonprofit, we have an account executive. We all know that the Amazon world is huge, right? Even within Amazon, I don't think they realize how many different divisions. But the account manager has allowed us to connect us. Go and speak to the AI team. Go and speak to the Alexa team. Go and speak to these different partners to be able to show and discuss best practices. So if you guys are not working with your account managers, please do, because for us, it's been a game changer in the work that we've been able to do in terms of being able to expedite the work that we do.
This is a really good story, so thank you for sharing with us. My question is going back to some of the things that you mentioned earlier, where I want to know more about how you've incorporated the feedback loop of what you were just talking about, to say you've got different audience or different community members performing their analysis, then how is that being brought back into your models so that the AI is actually learning from these different perspectives and interpretations and not just its own trained model?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, we're not there quite yet with like the AI and say some type of iterative learning model, but where we are with the feedback, though, I think is important to highlight. So one of the tools that we've built also has this sort of sharing capability, so then students or non-technical individuals have the ability to share essentially their dashboards or the information that they've written. So there's essentially just like a no-code sort of website builder that's able to bring in the analyses that they've done in the Fusion Center and quote-unquote publish it. So we've done a number of different use cases where, say, students have come in. One off the top of my head was related to SDOH and COVID-19 in New York State, where then they're able to share that information, because again, I think one of the big barriers is how do you make people aware of the work that you've done, to then get that feedback, to then learn from, okay, what did I miss, what do I need to keep on doing, and what do I need to change? And we have part of that right now, but that's going to be another sort of one of those rabbit holes that I'm really looking forward to going down as it relates to the reincorporation of the knowledge that's then been transformed via the subject matter experts, whether it's a student or a local community member, and then how do you bring that back into the model? So I think it's a great question, and I think that's also what everyone's trying to figure out like right now. How do you, again, make the models less biased based on who they're impacting, right? Yeah.
I think overall we're doing a good job with our pilot projects, that we're working with them and not them just alone in silos, so that we could get real time, as close to real time feedback as possible. But you're right. I mean, Hans, I think we're just getting started, and I think that's part of that next phase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and that's one thing that I've really liked personally working with Luis and HIT. So before I worked as a nurse, worked on med-surg, cardiac units, and always like to touch things and be physically present, because I think that's really the only way that you really understand what's going on, the sort of nonverbal communication that you can't really pick up easily on a Zoom call. It still baffles my mind that some care providers are able to do as well as they do via, say, a telehealth call, but we're making it work. So per Luis, when we do a community-based project, actually flying to, whether it's like St. John's or St. Thomas, or, going into San Juan for a weekend and speaking with the local leaders and the community to figure out what's going on. And then we bring on the other technical experts afterwards to then translate that into a solution for us to test. So it's been a very much, sort of fun, iterative process from that sense.
Yeah, and just real quick, one of the things that we've been doing is these listening tours, right? It's not just the pilot, but actually getting into the communities and listening to the communities, right? Remember I mentioned this disparities, this local, right? And really trying to understand the communities and get feedback from them. So it's not just, here's the tool, but how can we help you? And what are the issues that you're facing locally?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. The first is, what's your vision for this Infuse Center? If you see the best, how this to be used by whom? And also, where do you see you need help? Kind of which the part is you need help the most from private sectors. Another question is a little bit more technical. Earlier, you guys mentioned about there were thousands of different entities. You need to import the data into this place. I can imagine there were different systems or databases. How do you do that? It just, to me, it's just such a big thing. It's just so complicated. Can you do it with one tool, or how do you do that?
So to answer this, I think it was your second question, and now, of course, I'm going to blank out on the questions. The second question was related to why do we need help from the community, whether it's private or public, and I think that's related to the volume and just to the
Where do you need help most?
Yeah. So the help is in the interpretation and actually bringing together some of the problems that the community wants to be answered. So Luis and I and the rest of the NHIT team and everyone else, we don't have all of the questions and we don't have all of the answers. So we want the community or parts of the community or specific members or associates to help provide us with those questions that they feel are most needed to be answered, are most impactful, and then have a different set of requests for then those more technical users, say whether it's academic or private sector, that actually has the individuals that can answer those questions that really involve a lot more of an analytical skill set. So I think it's sort of like twofold there, where we're looking for partners that are technical and non-technical.
Yeah, early on, I just remember having these conversations. Everybody thought we was going to have the answers to all the questions, right? The reality is that it's impossible for us to do that, right? That is really up to the researchers and the community to pose the questions and really decide what are the issues they're trying to resolve, right? We could we could centralize the data. We could talk about social determinants of health and health equity, right? But at the end of the day, it's up to the researcher and the community and the stakeholders to decide what are the issues they're trying to resolve.
For your third question related to the variety of different data sources, I guess, from the different state, federal agencies. Federal is quite simple, even though there's a ton of different branches, but they all follow a similar convention of where they store the information. So we've kind of mapped out and we've discovered, what those breadcrumbs are and how to follow the trail. So we could then just write some generic scripts that then try the different permutations for those sites that are publicly available to bring that data down. But then for some of the local, state agencies, then that's where it's really been a case-by-case basis where we're slowly building up that repository based on who are the next key collaborators that we're working with. So Illinois, New York, New Jersey, California, Michigan, yeah. So slow iterative process, which is then why we're also then looking for more academic partners also to help with part of that onboarding and ingestion process.
And with that said, I think we're over time. Thank you all seriously for coming, spending the time with us, and please follow up with us. Andy?